I happened to find an old blog article in the comments for this article that was probably written around 2006, 2007, right when the dribble drive motion was starting to take off, and people had different characterizations of the model. And so the article was basically about the idea of organized street ball. Because that was one of the big criticisms when dribble drive motion started. It was just, coach rolling out the ball, and just letting players, dribble and jack up bad shots. That was the criticism. And so I remember when I was young, when coaches didn't overcoach, they were kind of labeled as, oh, they just let their athletes go out and play. And oftentimes, the difference went along racial lines. So a coach of a black team that had a bunch of athletes, oh, that coach doesn't really do anything. He just has a bunch of athletes. They just go out and run and jump and win games that way. Whereas a coach of an all-white team with perceived less athleticism but perceptions of more skill, well, that coach is really disciplined. Their guys play hard, and all the typical racial stereotypes that we tend to hear within basketball. And then that was kind of furthered when dribble drive motion started, and it was kind of the idea along those lines. And one of the arguments that I made when dribble drive motion was first starting, and also my version, blitz basketball, which I started with younger kids around 2000, is that to me, to run it effectively, it's not a matter of athleticism, it's a matter of skill. And that to me has been the difference. And that's the argument that I continue to make, whether it's dribble drive motion or read and react, which I'm not that familiar with, my blitz basketball, the ideas in Saba. Just in general, the ideas of a coach kind of taking a step back, not calling a set play every single time, not standing on the sideline barking all the time. The problem is when you do that, it tends to be a perception that coach is not coaching as much. That the coach on the other end who's up screaming and yelling and calling out plays, well, that's coaching. And the coach who, has just a system in place, whether, it could even be a triangle offense, whatever system it is that allows the coach to not have to call plays on every single possession, allows the players to come down, get into whatever they're going to run, look to exploit advantages, look to create shots for themselves, look to create shots for teammates, essentially play basketball. That tends to, when a coach is able to do that, in my opinion, that is much harder and much more difficult to do than simply putting in a bunch of plays. But popularly, it tends to be criticized as, oh, well, that coach, they just have better players, or they just have more athletes, or the coach isn't really doing anything, they're coaching themselves. And you even see that in the NBA last year when, at a timeout, LeBron James comes in and LeBron James is talking in the huddle. And so everybody starts to criticize Blatt, he's lost control, the players are running the asylum, the coach doesn't do anything. But then, of course, when Greg Popovich does the same thing and Tony Parker runs a huddle, well, then it's great coaching. And so, again, it's people finding the narrative that fits their opinion. And so, people didn't like Blatt or didn't think Blatt was a great coach, so they use that as evidence. People think Popovich is a genius, so they use that as evidence, even though it's the same exact behavior from each coach. And so a lot of the narratives that we create around coaching tends to stereotype players and stereotype coaches. And in a lot of ways, I think it undermines some coaches' ability to try to coach in what I would consider a better or more positive approach. I know a coach who I believe was fired, at least in part, because the coach allowed the players to play. And sometimes it looked ugly. They took bad shots, they made some turnovers, but the players really did improve over the course of the season, and they probably punched slightly above their weight in terms of their talent level. But when you looked at the other teams, the other team maybe looked more organized because the coach was up yelling and the coach was calling a play every single time, and they slowed the game down and they ran a play, and it appeared that they were taking specific shots with specific players based on these plays. Whether that's true or not, probably not. They probably took bad shots as well. But if you take a bad shot coming off a screen, people think that's good basketball. If you take a bad shot, off dribble penetration, well, now the coach isn't doing anything. And so I think, this goes back to, the article and the discussion that we had, that included at least one player or one person who's involved with an NBA team now, and I know another person that was on that thread is a pretty high-level AAU coach who sent multiple players onto the college level. And to me, if you're able to run a dribble drive motion effectively, or some kind of offense like that, where players can make decisions and utilize their skills, that to me is great coaching, because it takes a high level of skill to run a dribble drive motion effectively. Dribble drive motion is not just for athletes. You have to have shooters. I mean, I remember going and watching, Vance Wahlberg's team when he was at first. I saw him when he was at Clovis West, and then when he was at Fresno City, and he had 3 or 4 good shooters, especially when he was at Fresno City. He had a good point guard. Jackson, I think, played at Arizona State. He had his son was one of the shooters, who I think played at St. Mary's College. And they had, not only were they shooting, but they were shooting deep shots. And this was before Steph Curry, when people thought taking, a shot from 3 or 4 feet beyond the three-point line was crazy. My point is, I think too often the way that we evaluate or judge coaches does impact the way that coaches coach. Because if you're criticized or potentially fired for allowing players to play and giving them some freedom and encouraging them to make decisions, acknowledging that of course they're going to make bad decisions every once in a while, they're going to take bad shots, and if that causes people to evaluate you poorly or fire you, why would you take that chance when you can take the easy route, which is calling set plays every single time down and demanding players do exactly what you tell them to do? But that's not really necessarily going to make those players better or make them into real basketball players. I think the way that we evaluate coaches, the way that we stereotype players, especially using racial stereotypes and stereotyping coaches based on who they are coaching, I think all these things have a negative effect on how we coach and how coaches perceive each other, how coaches perceive their jobs as coaches. And I think if we do a better job of trying to reduce these racial stereotypes and reduce our evaluations and acknowledge the importance and the skill that it takes to get a group of athletes to play without having to call a play every single time down and to try to get good shots, the same way we praise the Warriors and praise Steve Kerr, but doing that at a younger level to me is even harder. Because you are going to have players who aren't quite as skilled and aren't professional athletes, and if you can do that in some way, that takes a lot of good coaching. And I think if we can change our perceptions of how we evaluate coaches and what we look for in coaches, maybe we can encourage more coaches to go down what I would call a more positive approach into coaching, and hopefully we can also reduce some of these racial stereotypes that I think tend to hold some players back or propel some players forward based on the stereotypes, and same thing with the coaches as well.